All right, it looks like the folks who are joining us today have slowed down entering into the webinar, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for a HPAI status update and just some informational programming in regards to HPAI avian influenza. Some housekeeping items for those who are joining us for the first time. So if you have any questions, please do type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, or we do have the raise hand feature and we can unmute you after a speaker is completed with their presentation. I would also like to note that the information here today is not public. So if you would like to share some information either with folks inside your company and or outside of your company, please connect with us afterwards and we'll connect you with one of those speakers in regards to items that you can share. For those who are members of Minnesota Turkey Growers Association, this webinar is recorded and will be posted on the NTGA members only portal, along with all of the previous webinars that we've done this year and in previous years. So we have a robust lineup today of folks to talk about high-path avian influenza from multiple agencies, as well as folks outside of academia and the agencies that you typically see on these webinars. So again, if you have any questions, go ahead and let one of us know. We'll make sure we get you connected and we'll share some contact information afterwards. I also just want to remind folks of resources that we have for our members and for folks involved in the poultry industry outside of the Minnesota Turkey Growers Association. So obviously we have all of the information that I just referenced on our website, but you can also find disease alerts and other type of information regarding high-path on our website. And then the go-to source for all of the information in regards to current situation for high-path avian influenza is the Board of Animal Health. And so that's a good segue for us to welcome Dr. Shauna Voss to share some information in regards to sample submission, as well as any other pertinent high-path avian influenza information that is willing to share with us today. So Shauna, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you for having me. Hopefully you're seeing my screen.
Yeah, we see it.
Perfect. All right, so I'm going to give you a quick update on our current situation in Minnesota regarding high-path avian influenza, as well as some information, as was mentioned, on sample submission to the lab. So as of today, we have 11 cases that have been confirmed in Minnesota. And just so you know, this event started in October, at the beginning of October. October 8th was our first detection. Our last commercial detection was back in 2022, and that was December 12th of 2022. So we did have a lull in our commercial cases detecting. We had two small flocks or backyard flocks that were detected in the spring, but no commercial infection. So as you can see, these are mostly turkey farms that have been infected, but we have two backyard or non-commercial cases that were detected. And this is a continuation of our event that started back in March in Minnesota of 2022. And so that brings our total case count up to 123 cases. I know sometimes we get questions about the disease alerts, and so I just thought I'd just throw a quick slide up here to explain the difference between the different disease alerts that you may be getting, either directly from our agency, if you're a member of the Emergency Disease Management Committee, or through the MTGA, which sends them out to their members. And so we do send out 2 alerts for every case that we get, and one is a suspect disease alert that looks like the alert that's on the left-hand side of the screen. And this is when we've got positive or non-negative testing that happens at our null lab. So that's either the MPTL in Wilmer or the Veterinary Diagnostic Lab. And then once we have confirmation from the National Veterinary Services Laboratory, we send out a follow-up confirmation disease alert. And so you may think that you're getting a lot of emails and you may think that it's a lot of different cases, but it's important to kind of remember and look for that suspect versus confirmation up in the subject line. And you can also track your cases down in the body of the email where we give this MNAIW number, and that's just an internal tracking system that we assign to every case, but then you can track those numbers to make sure that, we're not double counting cases. For our high path cases, they also get assigned a special ID by county. And so, for this example, Meeker 10, you can see was on the suspect alert as well as the confirmation alert. And you can continue to track updates on what's happening in Minnesota on our Board of Animal Health website. And so if you go to the main page, there's a one click to get into the high path page, and you'll find a lot of information there about cases and control areas and permitting and all those questions that frequently come up when we're in an event. So my job today is just to make sure that you guys are ready and prepared to submit samples for diagnostic testing as needed. So before we do that, I also just want to mention and remind you guys all how to report if you suspect that something's going on with your flock. So there's 3 different ways that you can report. We do have an avian influenza hotline, and that number is here on the screen. We've got a sick bird report form where you can submit an online report, and that is monitored evenings and weekends. And then for you guys, for the commercial industry, call me directly on my cell phone number, and my number is listed there on the screen. And I will make sure that you are hooked up to make sure that we can get testing done, whether it's evenings, weekends, or during business hours. So biggest thing is to make sure that you guys have supplies on hand so that we're not running around trying to find supplies when we really need to be getting those samples collected into the lab. So brain heart infusion media is the liquid media that you will use to collect those samples. It comes to you frozen. You'll need swabs in order to swab your birds, and then barcode labels. And all of these supplies are available through the Minnesota Poultry Testing Laboratory, or if you work with a larger processing company, they will be able to provide those supplies too. So make sure that all of your farms have ready access to these supplies so that you can get samples collected in a hurry if needed. And I'm not going to go through how to collect those samples, but we did make a video last year as a reminder, because especially if you're a commercial meat type bird, you're used to collecting blood samples for your NPIP testing, but you might not do a lot of PCR or oral pharyngeal swab sample collection. And so if you either take a picture of this little dinosaur on your screen or click into that YouTube link, there's a short video on how to collect those samples. So it's a good time to take a refresher on how to do that. And as we did in 2022, we are encouraging the use of barcode labels because that helps to make sure that the samples that are being collected are tracked properly through both the laboratories as well as our databases that we use to track these samples. And just a reminder, because I know it's a little confusing, the barcode stickers that we send you come in a set of 4. You are only going to use 2 of those stickers, and we do have a handout on how to apply those. So 1 sticker goes on your sample, 1 sticker goes on your submission form, and then the other 2 stickers are discarded and not used again. And if you have questions on that, we're happy to explain that further. And then, of course, every submission to the laboratory must have a submission form that goes along with that. We do have a lot of different types of submission forms, and so I just wanted to remind you of the different types available. So when you submit your samples for routine NPIP monitoring, and the submission form that we train our testing agents to use is that board NPIP routine monitoring submission form. That's the one that's up on the very top left side of the screen. There's also a diagnostic submission form. So these are testing that's not required by the state, and it is billable back to the client. That uses kind of the non-regulatory diagnostic form, and that's got the U of M logo up on the top left-hand screen. And then the form that I want to point out today is for our high-path avian influenza submission form. And I just want to remind everybody, because people probably have this form sitting around from our event last year, only use this submission form when you're directed to by somebody within the event. So if you end up in a control area and you need to do permitted movement testing or surveillance testing, or if you have sick birds, that's the time that this submission form will be used. And again, this is a different submission form than we normally use for our day-to-day operations. So we made a second video for how to complete this form. So again, you can grab your phone and grab a picture of this QR code, or we can send it out after the webinar to make sure that you've got that available and know how to fill out that submission form. The other thing that I just want to remind you about is the number of samples to collect. And that is sometimes confusing because it varies on the situation on why you're collecting those samples. I'm not going to go into the details of control area surveillance testing or permitted movement testing, because those will be covered by people who contact you if you end up in a control zone. So follow the directions that they give you for how many samples to collect and how often. But if you have sick birds at home and you need to get samples to the lab, we are going to request that you collect samples from 30 birds per barn. So that will be pooled 10 swabs per tube of BHI and submitted. So you'll submit 3 pooled samples per barn using that high-path avian influenza submission form. And as a reminder, always, always, always sample from your daily mortality. So we're more likely to pick up the avian influenza virus if we're sampling from our deads versus the healthy birds. And I do want to give a quick shout out to the University of Minnesota Extension, Abby Schuft, Carol Cardona, and their teams put together a couple infographics here that I just wanted to share today because they're great. And puts the plug in for some biosecurity as well. So they put together 2 infographics, and these are readily available to post in your barns or to share with your company. One of them is just about being observant of your biosecurity plans and adapting to what's happening around you. So if you're seeing wild waterfowl migrate through, if you're seeing birds congregate out in the field next to your barn, if you end up in a control area, there's additional things that we want you to be doing to make sure that you're keeping that virus out of your farm. It's called exclusionary biosecurity. So this infographics is a really nice reminder on that practice to just be observant and look what's happening around you. And the second reminder that they made an infographic for is about retraining on biosecurity. So we do biosecurity every single day, but it's easy to start forgetting steps. It's easy to forget all of the protocols if it's not something that you do every day. So now is a good time to make sure that everybody is retrained, okay? So revisit those practices, talk through them again, make sure that everybody remembers and is retrained on all of the steps, because then we're less likely to make mistakes. And now is not the time to be making mistakes. Now is the time to make sure that we're keeping that virus out of our farms. And again, these are our contact numbers. If you've got any questions, please reach out to us if you've got any concerns about the health of your flock. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna. I don't see any questions here in the Q&A just yet. So if folks have questions that come up as we work through our speakers, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A or into the chat. So next we have joining us is Dr. Carol Cardona from the University of Minnesota, giving a global perspective on high path. So Dr. Cardona, there she is. And if you're talking, Terrell, we can't hear you. You're still muted.
Okay, now you can see my slide, what we can expect in 2023.
You bet. Thank you.
Okay, and now you can see me too. All right. So for those of you that have been sleeping under rocks, I just want to remind you what it is we're talking about. We're talking about the ecology of avian influenza, something that poultry producers here in Minnesota have dealt with for a very long time. But in 1996, the world changed, and that was when the emergence of Goose Guangdong, 1996, which was an H5 highly pathogenic influenza virus, came into being. It soon replaced the circulating strains of avian influenza and became endemic in wild birds and in poultry populations in Asia. Oops. It then in 2005 crossed the Ural Mountains and began to emerge in Europe, where it quickly also became endemic. In 2015, we saw our first introduction of this virus from the West Coast into the United States and saw our first outbreaks across the nation in the largest to date, at that time, for an animal disease outbreak ever. But quickly, we learned that our own North American influenza viruses came back into being. And while the goose guandong remained endemic in the European and Asian continents, we still had our North American viruses, and the Eurasian virus was kicked out. That was until 2022, when we saw, well, actually 2021, when we first saw a new introduction from the East Coast of Eurasian goose guandong lineage viruses. We actually saw 6 different incursions over 2022, and likely in retrospect, we'll be able to see that there have been more. In 2023, I think we now can see that we have endemic goose guandong lineage HPAI in our wild birds. So the ecology has changed, the world has changed. There's some things we learned in 2022 that will persist into the future. We will continue to see cases in spring and in fall. The cases in our spring outbreaks are likely to be more representative of new viruses being introduced. So we may see more a different type of spread in the spring. We know that migration is different in the spring, that the birds are racing to the north as fast as they can get there. And that's over the winter and into the wintering grounds is our more likely place to see the introductions of new viruses to our area. And that the cases in the fall will occur as a function of birds migrating south, and the migration takes place over a different time frame, as we know for many years of history with influenza viruses, but also that now that we're in our second year, that we're likely to see birds that have antibodies to HPAI and are protected, and that the cases are really being caused by the hatch year birds, which will not have the protective antibodies. And so it's going to look a lot more like a low path outbreak. We're going to continue, I think, to see something that we saw in 2022 and 2015, that impacts and exposure across the United States are not equal, right? So the majority of birds, the bird populations are shown in green here. This is a map of 2012, so it's a little out of date, but I think it still holds pretty true. But yet we saw 90% of the cases in the northern part of the states. And if we were to divide that even further, it would look much more like an Arctic rain type of approach. So the virus is definitely affects our state more than it does other states. And even though Minnesota and North Carolina both have lots of turkeys, we're always going to see more cases here in Minnesota, not necessarily because our biosecurity, but also because we're in the north. So more exposure. So in 2022, I think we're going to also continue to see these same trends where turkeys, because of their high susceptibility, are heavily impacted. And I'm not sure if the backyards or small flocks are going to be as affected. They tend to be affected more in the spring than in the fall, likely, and more across the country than they have been in the northern states. But we can use them as a measure of places that have very low levels of biosecurity. So we know that biosecurity can work with this virus, and we know that turkeys are likely to continue to be susceptible. We also learned in 2022 that poultry are not the same. So the secure food supply modelers, Amos and Peter, did the R0s for different poultry species. And an R0 is simply the number of naive hosts that are infected when one host is infected. So in the case of Ebola, which scares us to death, right? Everybody's scared when I say Ebola. One person who's infected will transmit that virus to 2 new people. So the outbreak continues at a rate of 2 people for every infected person. That's similar to what we saw in broiler chickens with this particular, with the 2.3.4.4b virus. And, but layers had a much higher R0, closer to the range of, sort of between chikungunya and measles. And that shows you how much more rapidly the virus can spread through a population of layers. And the best is always the turkeys, which have an ungodly R0. And, you can understand now why the first thing, you might see is a big number of mortality when you see HPAI. The virus is here to stay, something we learned in 2022 as well. They will continue to circulate in North American species, and I think we're going to continue to see new strains introduced annually or every other year for the foreseeable future. That means that the viruses that evolve here in our North American strains of waterfowl and other wild birds will continue to move away from the current antibodies that those waterfowl have. In addition, the birds in Europe and in Asia will be continuing to evolve their new strains. Those 2 strains, those 2 evolutions will create new lineages that will be different. So we could continue to see viruses that were born here in the USA and also born overseas that will threaten our domesticated poultry. And the risk of infection today is not strictly associated with migration as it was in 2022. And kind of, we've known that for a long time, but it's a combination risk of migration that's partially mitigated with the antibodies that the older birds would have. In other words, it's going to be more like the low HPAI that we saw. So when you see birds coming in, that tells you that you're at risk. It doesn't mean that you are necessarily exposed. So in 2022, I think we could say that you were at risk and likely exposed when you saw those birds. But now we're saying there's not as many of those birds that have high levels of virus that they're shedding. So now we're here, 2023, we'll stop learning from 2022. So these are some reports from the USAHA meeting that recently took place. In Minnesota breeding colonies, they reported that naive juvenile ducks had 20% low path influenza prevalence in 2023. So that's a little different. We still have low path to worry about. And that's along with some high path prevalence. Pacific flyway, gulls and seabirds, high path AI virus positive in 2023, but less so than they were in 2022. Don't believe we have any studies happening in our area right now on gulls and seabirds. Andy Ramey up in Alaska, and of course that's going to be mostly Pacific flyway, but birds also come our way from there. They're doing Arctic geese surveillance, and he shows that the Emden goose is about 95% antibody positive. So he thinks they are at low risk for carrying the virus. We have to put all of this information together and try to make a guess. And then raptors in the coastal areas and here in Minnesota, especially bald eagles, are over 60% H5 antibody positive. And I think that may be the best information we have about how much virus is in our flyway. In spring of 2022, obviously, we saw a lot more cases than we did have in 2023. Again, the small flocks are more represented in the spring months than the commercial flocks. In fall of 2023, by this time, we had 13 cases, and by this time now, we have 11 cases. We all know that the migration is not over. But I've just been telling you there should be antibodies out there in those wild birds that are protecting you to some degree. So I'm hopeful that we're going to, although we are likely to continue to see a few cases, maybe we won't see as many as 2022. So if we look at what happened in 2022, we saw, a basic progression down the Minnesota River Valley here in Minnesota. And we're seeing the same thing in 2023, shown in the blue arrows. The Minnesota River is in red. And here's a picture of the Minnesota River Valley along with some highlights to show you kind of where it is. And so we're not seeing anything outside of that, which, may change as new types of birds, new species of birds come down. But we know also that much of our flyaway has, over the years shifted to the west. And so we've continued to maintain this Minnesota River Valley migration pathway, but a lot of the migrants also go through South Dakota, North Dakota. And here are some of the small flocks as well. So the Pine County case is, of course, the one outlier here. So I still think fewer cases this fall. Low path AI is a threat, unlike in 2015 and 2022. We saw that the high path AI virus kind of displaced all other influenza viruses. And in 2015, if you recall, 2016, we didn't have any low path cases, which hadn't happened since 1997. And so we may start to see low path AI again. And we have to then remember, Shauna showed you all of those different forms. Remember what our low path response is as opposed to our high path response. Predicting where cases will be is complicated because the proportion of wild birds that have antibodies, but hatchier birds are likely to be unprotected, just like they are when they're transmitting low path. So I'm guessing that farms that have had low path previously are at risk for low path again. And this might be the best way to predict high path risk. I think that we're always in new grounds here. So also at USAHA this year, we had some quotable quotes. So we had from Maryland, what's the 21st century plan for high path AI control? This was during the vaccination discussion. In the 90s, we moved birds indoors. What change are we going to make now? This was in response to the discussion that there was a lot of discussion of vaccination, and that vaccination will not be used. And if it was going to be used, we would kill the birds immediately afterwards. And so the state vet from California said, why the hell would anyone in the US vaccinate to kill? Ben Weilman, all right, I paraphrased here. He said, pull on your big boy pants and start negotiating. This was what he actually said was he encouraged the USDA to start negotiations with specific trade partners and be creative, not just sit on their thumbs. And so I've paraphrased it to pull on your big boy pants, since we all know Ben. And Rosemary Sifford told us that USDA will only consider vaccination if eradication costs exceed vaccination and surveillance in vaccinated flocks, or if zoonotic cases happen, or food insecurity, or limitations with indemnity and compensation. So the rest of the world right now is vaccinating or considering vaccination and is starting their vaccination planning. They don't like the depopulation of healthy animals. I don't think anybody here does either, but it's a difficult balance. And I think the rest of the world may be further along in that discussion than we are at this point. And my friends at USDA, I think we have to just say the just say no approach will not last forever. We had 2 weeks ago this new announcement of CRISPR resistant chickens. It's a breakthrough for sure. It's not something that we can push the easy button and say, okay, well, we'll just place resistant chickens. First of all, placing resistant chickens wouldn't change the dynamics of flu at all, would it? Because you guys have turkeys, and we know how important other species of birds are in the ecology of flu, and it's not just about the chickens. So there's going to be new technologies. There are other things on the horizon and that are already here that will likely be pushed forward by scientists who are not chickenologists and who are not being consulted by these biochemists and others who are making these discoveries. So it's a great time for science, but it's going to be very hard to keep a lid on some of these ideas and some of these progressions forever. So with that, I'll end with this quote from Charles Darwin. It's not the strongest or most intelligent, but the most flexible who will survive.
Thank you, Carol. I don't see any questions right now in the chat box, but I'm sure people are definitely
they're all in shock.
They're all in shock. Yeah. And speaking of quotable quotes, it's not just about the chickens. I wrote that down for all these conversations that we'll have going forward that seem to be chicken-esque.
And you can also put Ben's on there and apply it to anything.
That's right. That's right. So next we have joining us from the Waterfowl Alert Network is Maurice. So we wanted to invite somebody onto our webinar today to talk about ways that you can enhance your toolbox, I guess, for preventing high pathogen flocks. So we always talk about biosecurity. We spent a lot of the last legislative session anyway and into the spring talking about bird deterrence. But information is also power in regards to preventing high path in your flocks. And so we welcome Maurice to join us to talk about a tool that he has to help with making those types of informational decisions. So thank you.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. Can you guys hear me okay?
Sure can.
Perfect. Okay, so just by way of introduction, my name's Maurice Pitesky. My day job, I'm an associate professor of cooperative extension at UC Davis School of Vet Med, focused on poultry health and food safety epidemiology. And then in the wee hours of the night, I work on this Waterfowl Alert Network. So for about the past decade or so, I've worked in collaboration with a radar ornithologist, which I didn't know that exists until I randomly ran into a paper of his about 10, 12 years ago, named Jeff Bueller. And we've had some NEFA supported grants. And over the last year, we've commercialized the tool in order to, as quickly as possible, try to have this tool accessible to all the different stakeholders in the commercial poultry world. One of the things that you guys asked me to talk about, and my slide is not advancing. Oh, there we go. Is basically just the different tools associated with remote sensing of waterfowl and how they can be used correctly and incorrectly by commercial poultry folks. So the big one that commercial poultry use a lot already is Birdcast, which I'm assuming a lot of you are familiar with. So here is Birdcast's, they use radar, what are called NexRad radar, and those little green dots you see in that top left image from Birdcast's website, you guys are probably familiar with. Those are their 160 radar that we normally use in the US and around the world for forecasting and predicting rain. So the radar beam goes out, bounces off a raindrop, and then we can say it's raining, 30 kilometers away or whatever. Birdcast, and going back to World War II, people have kind of used radar to remotely understand birds, and you can be a little more clever than that and also focus it on waterfowl. But what Birdcast does is they use that same technology. The radar beam goes out, it bounces off birds that are migrating just in the air, not on the ground. And it sends a signal back. And here's kind of what this little GIF that I put here on the bottom left, that's kind of the types of signals that they process. And what they do is they take that heterogeneity, all the different colors there, the bright orange showing a high amount of waterfowl, the greens and blues showing lower amounts of birds, and they take that and they assign a single value to that. So they take a very heterogeneous heterogeneous space, and they just basically create one number of all birds that are aloft at night, because that's when migration happens. And then in between those green dots, they put a buffer around that of about 30 kilometers. And I'll explain this a couple times throughout the slides, just so we're all on the same page. And they create a score for those different green dots, and then they interpolate or krieg, what's called krieging in between that. So if you have one bird aloft score of 10, for example, at one radar, and another one at another radar of, let's say, 6, you know, if you were going to go to the midpoint of those two dots, the bird aloft score they would predict to be 8. So that's kind of basically what krieging is. So that's good and bad for our purposes. It's good in that we understand migration. It's bad in that we don't understand anything about what the birds, especially waterfowl, are doing on the ground. That's where the Waterfowl Alert Network comes in. And what we do, which is differently, we focus on where the waterfowl are roosting. And this time of year, when they're roosting after they've migrated, that's where they spend 10 to 14 hours a day potentially shedding virus in the environment. And when they go on their feeding flights every day, they only go about 2.5 to 3.5 kilometers from their roosting location. So that's not really captured by birdcast at all. And if you look at this birdcast from yesterday, you know, there's not too much activity where you are. If you looked at birdcast a week, 2 weeks ago, there'd be a lot of activity there. And the reality is birdcast actually turns off their dashboard November 15th, because there's just no migration occurring after that. It would be really boring to look at their dashboard. The radar is still on, but when birdcast turns off, at some level is when we need it the most. And that's just because there's no migration. It doesn't turn on again until we get into March or so. And it turns off again in the summer, because there's just no migration there. So advantages and disadvantages. The Waterfowl Alert Network, what we do is we take those radar, and if the waterfowl are leaving from a roosting ground, that's the signal that we focus on. And then we create models based upon where those waterfowl are leaving using things like satellite imagery. So every single day you're getting a distinct model for 5 months from the beginning of November to the end of March about where waterfowl are roosting, where they're spending 10 to 14 hours a day. And then the other thing that we do, because the Waterfowl Alert Network radar models only work for those 5 months, and in Minnesota and other states and other parts of Canada, AI is becoming more of a year-round issue. We can create what are called telemetry-based models, and that's basically just a cell phone that's on a duck or a goose, and we take all this historic data and we create very similar models using environmental predictors and things like that, which I'll explain again in a few minutes. So big picture, birdcast is awesome. It's great for birders because you can look at where the birds are going. But once migration is over, there's not really much to look at on birdcast, as you can kind of sort of see already. I'm not going to focus too much on this because Dr. Cardona did, but you know, why are waterfowl important to surveil? You know, I don't know if you guys looked at the USDA HPAI AI interim report, but you know, that there's a significant amount of the outbreaks that are attributed to wild bird transmission, with the majority of those obviously having at some level a waterfowl component to them. And the value of waterfowl tracking then, you know, when you look at that USDA interim report, they start using tools like Birdcast and eBird, which I'm going to talk about a little too, which are amazing tools out of Cornell and Colorado State. The issue with Birdcast, like I mentioned, is a similar issue with eBird, in the sense that when USDA SIA did their modeling, because the granularity of their models is much larger than the granularity of the models we develop for the Waterfowl Alert Network, they're seeing high risk activity where there's more bird activity, but the spatial windows they're using are 50 kilometers, which isn't really very practical, versus the spatial windows that we're seeing with the amount of data that we have from farms that participate in this tool is 4 kilometers. I'll talk about how we do that in a few minutes and what potentially some of the value and other applications of that are. One thing I wanted to point out, eBird's been around since 2001, Birdcast since 2018, Waterfowl Alert Network 2022. We are just scratching the surface of what we can do with all these tools, but they're here. And I think when I think about biosecurity, I look at biosecurity in two ways. I look at it as inward facing. So that's operational and physical biosecurity, and we're all very familiar with that, and that's obviously important. But I also think about outward facing biosecurity, and that's where we just don't have a system in place yet that all producers and stakeholders can use to understand where the waterfowl are roosting during our falls and winters, and where their habitat is the rest of the year. And we have the data to do that, and a lot of other things actually, which I'll just show you just a taste of in a few minutes. There was always can't remember what Zoom meetings I'm listening to these kind of things on, but USDA did have this summer, I believe, they kind of presented some results from a case control study, and I was furiously copying notes from their slides. And big picture, they did this kind of case control study, and they noticed, inward and outward facing factors that seemed to be predictive of farms that were popping with high-path AI. So that's great. The initial analysis was univariate. That's an issue for confounding and all these things like that. From a practical perspective, what that means is we just can't rely too heavily on which variables are super important and not super important until you do experiments to kind of control for those variables, which I'm sure they're doing. So I'm briefly going to talk about just a few tools. eBird, which is through Cornell, which is this amazing website. You can waste all kinds of time on that and on their app. Birdcast, which I said is relatively new. Then I'll talk a little about the Waterfowl Alert Network. I did want to mention, if you go on to the Waterfowl Alert Network, under our free resources, we have all these tools, the hyperlinks to all of them. And they all provide, I think, really interesting kind of pieces that I think are really important. But we don't have one tool that poultry producers can use where their farms are logged in, where they can sort their farms from highest waterfowl abundance to lowest waterfowl abundance, where they can look at historic data, where they can really understand, how waterfowl, that outward facing component, are interfacing with their barns, wind patterns, all those type of things. We, in my mind, and I'm biased obviously, but that's ultimately what we need. And I look at the Waterfowl Alert Network as basically just a weather, like a weather report for waterfowl. And in a perfect world, just like the weather is free, this type of tool should be free to all the stakeholders that need it. Where you see all these circles in the kind of pinkish color, that's where we have models developed. We're working on models in this kind of area over in the West. But you can see there's potential to literally model the entire US, because we have these 160 radar. I think there's it's a challenge to model it, but we've been recently developing some automated methods to screen radar, which is the rate limiting step in the process. But we can create a national network, and that can include Canada also. They have a similar system. eBird is a citizen science-based tool, so where they get most of their data is from where people live, which is not always, so the model is probably the least accurate. Maybe in rural areas where we probably want it to be the most accurate. Birdcast, like I mentioned, that just looks at birds that are aloft, not just waterfowl, but songbirds and other birds, and it just looks at migration. So it's not as exciting when we're in the fall and winter and we want to know where waterfowl are roosting around the U.S. and feeding. The USGS disease model is outstanding. It's a little coarse because it's at the county level, but I think ultimately you're going to be taking tools that like what we do and what USGS is doing in order to kind of tease out, which farms are potentially at highest risk. And the USDA and Canadian Food Inspection Agency websites are really nice. We actually have access to the USDA's API. So long story short, we can basically take any USDA high-path AI detections in wildlife at the county level and domestic poultry also at the county level. That goes into our system. So if you have a farm that's in a county that has been detected with high-path AI, that automatically gets put into our email alerts and things like that. The nice part about that is if you have 100 farms or 1,000 farms, or even 10 farms, it's nice to be able to not always have to rely on an email and your, kind of knowledge or your employees' knowledge of counties and things like that. So just to go into a little more detail on Birdcast, so it predicts bird migration, just birds aloft, from March 1st to June 15th and August 1st to November 15th. So it's great for that. It's an amazing tool, and it's relatively new. And like I said, they take this kind of heterogeneous signal and they create an average score. They're ingesting that data continuously. And like the Waterfowl Alert Network, they make predictions for 3 days because we can get those environmental predictors of waterfowl roosting, feeding, and flight. We can get them at an hourly level for a 3-day period. Once you get to 4 days, the way you purchase that data, it's not predictive enough at the hourly level. So you can start making, and we're starting to work on that with some folks, some 3-day predictions moving out, which I'll show you in a few minutes. There's no information on ground locations, and their granularity for Birdcast is 3 kilometers. And if you're in between those radars, that's probably where the model, is not as accurate, but that's similar to ours also. Now I'm going to just show you some eBird data. So eBird is the citizen science tool, and I'm just going to kind of scan through some slides. This is these eBird rasters or maps that you can download. And I look at eBird almost like an almanac because it's like at a general level, you can look at kind of roosting and feeding and getting a ballpark idea of where the waterfowl are. Obviously, every season's different. Climate's changing, so you can't use 2020 as a proxy for every other year moving forward. But pick your favorite spot of the U.S. I always focus on California, and in fact, unfortunately, in California, we're #1. When I look at all the farms that with the Waterfowl Alert Network, our waterfowl around our highest risk farms are an order of magnitude greater than waterfowl in any other part of the U.S. that we model currently. So here's every week. You can just kind of scan. Just kind of sort of see what it looks like, since we're not in the Dakotas, right? And these are just waterfowl. These are, I think, 16 species of waterfowl that I scraped off of their website. So now going over the Waterfowl Alert Network and how it works a little differently. We do daily roosting models using radar for 5 months from the beginning of November to the end of March. You can use the radar outside of that, but now you have too much other noise from other birds. So your data wouldn't be, we can't make predictive models outside of those months, unfortunately, using radar. That's where telemetry comes in. Telemetry has advantages and disadvantages, which I can talk about briefly. But ultimately, the Waterfowl Alert Network's designed for commercial poultry producers. You could sort farms. You can look at waterfowl abundance at different diameters from your farms. You can make all kinds of, you can sort your data, your farms different ways, and we create reports and things like that. You can look at wind speed. We do the 3-day forecasting now, and you can also do historical analysis back to 1995. So the NextRat system has that data available, and it's free in the US, which is amazing. I'm trying to slowly work with other countries to try to make their data publicly accessible, because I think there's a lot of potential with this in the EU, for example, and beyond. We also do it's higher resolution, so you're talking about, I think, 44 times more granular than the Birdcast and eBird models as far as the spatial granularity. So just very briefly, the way we do it, which is slightly different, and this is Jeff Bueller's kind of genius and the way that he kind of created a niche, and he's a radar biologist, and it's interesting that there's I think a very practical application of his tool for commercial poultry. But when the waterfowl leave at night on their roosting flights, that's that big orange signal you see on that GIF on the left. And then we can look at where they're leaving from And that's about an 80-kilometer diameter. And if they're leaving from cornfields that are, at this temperature, in these environmental conditions, near these farms, then we can put that into our model. And then every single day, we can use ground-based sensors through PRISM and satellite imagery through MODIS to look for moisture, for example, in order to incorporate into our daily model and our 3-day predictive models. So hopefully that makes a little sense. So this is Minnesota, and the left-hand side here is the eastern aspects of the Dakotas. Up here is the kind of finger of Lake Superior, I believe. And we've got northern Iowa down here. But these are just some waterfowl abundance models. You can see at the top there, we're scrolling through the days. And this is what last year looked like. So the more data we collect, the more we can really understand how consistent waterfowl abundance modeling is, which would be nice, because then we can have some kind of understanding of where potentially the highest waterfowl abundance around these farms are, and potentially where we should be surveilling a little more relative to commercial poultry, and those type of things. And then we can also do telemetry for the months that we don't have radar, and also to I guess, support our radar modeling. So here's some USGS telemetry data that we use for modeling. And the nice part about these data is that it gives you an occupancy score, which is a little different. Now this number is between 0 and 1, as opposed to an abundance of waterfowl using radar. But the nice part about occupancy is you can get specific species of waterfowl. So if you ultimately found out that there were certain species you're interested in, as long as there's telemetry data for that, which is a big kind of issue, especially in Minnesota. But if there's telemetry data, we can create these kind of models. So we were able to create some telemetry models for March using some additional data. And you can go onto a website called MoveBank, and you can reach out to those academics who have their telemetry data and see if you can use it for these kind of purposes. So it's a really powerful technique, but it's got limitations too. I'm not going to go over this too much, but the great thing about telemetry data, you can do disease modeling. So this time, like a year and a half ago, this is when I was telling people in California to be really careful because we were going to probably get hammered by HPAI. And this is what we call a SEIR model. I'm not going to go into too much detail because this model, unfortunately, I always tell people I only like to be right about baseball, who's going to win the World Series, not about this kind of stuff. But unfortunately, we got hammered last year, as everyone knows. But you can use telemetry data and surveillance data to make these really sophisticated models. And this is a simple one that USGS kind of took the lead on, which was, I think, really helpful, especially visually when you're showing it to producers. This is what the Waterfowl Alert Network kind of website looks like. As I mentioned, I'm a big baseball fan, so our new interface uses cards, and you can rank those cards from highest to lowest based on waterfowl abundance, based on which counties you've had HPAI detections in. And I think a lot of companies, what I'm really keen on is to have these cards flip and to have your inward biosecurity data on the other side of the card. I work with a lot of poultry data, and as I think we all know, there's a lot of incomplete data too. So I think this also is a way for companies to better organize what data they need to collect, because I've worked with several companies that are interested in understanding that interface between outward and inward facing biosecurity, and ultimately a lot of the data is just not present to really make those assessments. So I think ultimately we're going to want tools like this to also identify which farms we need to get better data from with respect to physical biosecurity. And then you can look at the data and you can sort, you can create monthly reports and do all those type of things, which I think, again, we're just scratching the surface of. Just to show you kind of one potential application, this is a location further west of you guys, but each of these pixels, we were predicting that these birds, using some telemetry modeling from a student, we were predicting that these cells here were going to leave this morning and end up in a location further north of here. I'm waiting to hear back eagerly to see if our predictions are right. I don't know yet, but we can also make 3-day predictions for other applications. And the nice part about telemetry and radar is that they kind of feed off each other. So there's all kinds of things that you can do with this. It's just a matter of really kind of honing in on what the practical applications of, and I think that's ultimately where we need to start. These kind of rasters and calculating this, I was talking to someone, I know the state of USDA is working with several states up in your guys' area, and they're really focusing on, I'll finish up in a minute, but they're really focusing on understanding, risk, but it's more of an inward-facing biosecurity kind of assessment. And I've really been trying to kind of encourage them to think about using tools like this, where we can go back to 2014, 2015, and really quantitatively assess waterfowl abundance around all of these farms that they're doing visits to and things like that. I'm not going to talk too much about kind of what I'm also interested in, but we can restore some habitat away from farms in order to draw waterfowl away from them. I think that's also, we need tools like this in order to really be able to think about those long-term goals that I think we need to consider. And then I'll just briefly say, like, it's a subscription to be part of the service. In my perfect world, I think the feds and the states will be participatory with the companies, almost like an MPIP model, because I think ultimately we want everyone to have access to the tool, including backyarders and things like that. And with that, I'll take any questions. Briefly mention, my friend made one of these 4 images, and then I took that image and using Dolly, I made 3 of the 4 using ChatGPT. So not as insightful as Darwin, but hopefully kind of amusing. Thank you.
Yeah, we've been experimenting a little bit with the AI picture generation, so there's some fun stuff that can and cannot do. But thank you for the information. Again, if there are folks who have questions, let us know. Otherwise, we will send out follow-up information about the Waterfowl Alert Network. So thank you for your time. Our final speaker today is Fidel Hegney. I'm sorry if I butchered your last name. He is with the USDA and will be sharing some information in regards to the USDA indemnity programming. So thank you for joining us.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
So let me see if I can put it on slide mode. Because of bandwidth situations, I'm going to try to turn my camera off for now. Let me just see. Are you seeing the presentation?
Yes, I see it, but it's not in present mode.
It's on my end. You're not seeing it as present. Okay, let me look at display setting. Display slideshow. Okay. How about that?
Still in present mode, but there we go. Now we got it.
Okay. I would take this opportunity just to speak to my stakeholders, and I thought of, presenting just on depop and disposal would not be just the only thing that I'd like you guys to have as information for an update in terms of our policy. Just for an editorial comment, this presentation has a lot of information in it. This is a presentation that we've kind of been given to many stakeholders in different states. So this presentation will be shared if it's requested, so folks can have it as a reference for some of the policy changes that we want to share with our stakeholders. So first of all, I just like folks to just understand that one of the policies that we started implementing in this outbreak that started in 2022 was the definition of poultry. Before, we used to look at things as just clearly backyard or commercial, and all that was tied to reporting. Now we're looking at things if they're poultry or if they're non-poultry. A lot of times people try to figure out where did that word non-poultry came from. For me, I thought it was going to be not poultry, but again, the word that is used globally is non-poultry, and I think it's probably a French translation. So the biggest thing for us is when we have a confirmed premises for in each state, the first thing that we need to, first of all, do is to classify that premises. Easy when it's commercial, but when it gets to the backyard side of things, it can be backyard poultry or it can be backyard non-poultry. So when it's a backyard non-poultry, basically that should not affect your status of HPAI in your country. So that should not be affecting trade. So initially in this outbreak, there was a lot of countries that were all learning about the new WOA, basically guidelines, and it took a while for folks to realize that they should not be giving us any headache on non-poultry premises. So we still have one country that still put trade restrictions on that. I put this information out here. You could see that on the left side is what the old definition was, and on the right side is what the new definition is. They added the new bullet that you see in red that we never had, and that is the bullet that is giving us a lot of headache. Not only us, some other countries that have huge poultry production, and that trade is easily impacted. So I want folks to understand that. We have then basically gone back to WOA, the World Organization for Animal Health, to say we didn't like that definition. And this was the proposal that we presented in May. And they looked at it and they said, okay, can you bring it up in a September meeting? And then basically we brought it again in the September meeting. And what we're just proposing here is on the first bullet, we want them to take away basically birds that are used for restocking a supply of big game. So we have premises in the United States, we're a hunting country. Those premises, sometimes they put birds there just to hunt. And so we're trying to say that those are not poultry. Basically, those birds are put there to be hunted. And if you shoot them, you don't kill them, they fly away, they become wild birds, correct? So why should I be affecting trade? So we're trying for them to take that off. And then we're trying for them then to insert that in the last bullet that basically covers a lot of what is non-poultry. So if you have show birds, racing birds, exhibition birds, zoological collection, pet birds, and basically birds that are specifically raised for release, that should not be poultry. So that's our proposal. And then in the second bullet, that whole thing about you having few birds in your backyard and you're using or you're selling the eggs or the meat exclusively in your house. I mean, if you're selling the eggs or meat, it becomes poultry. If you're consuming it exclusively in your household, it's not poultry. We want to remove the word exclusively, because if you think about us in the United States and our culture, we do have a lot of FFA kids, 4-H kids. We don't want a 4-H kid that has 6 chickens in their backyard collecting eggs and is giving eggs to their brothers and sister friends, and then that becomes poultry, as if that those products will end up internationally, correct? So those are some of the things we're finding behind the scene. And so this is just a summary for what we've done. You know, we contacted other countries, the Quad Alliance, Canada, the Americas, so that, you know, when we contacted the Americas, I think Canada was the only one that kind of supported us in terms of what we were proposing. The other Americans didn't see that they should support us. So unfortunately, that's how it goes sometimes with the big players. So everybody needs to fight against us. So we're waiting to see what will happen in the next time that they meet. On some of this chart that I have in front of you is just to walk you through the classification of the premises, correct? What we're emphasizing on moving forward is right here, okay? If there's no evidence that exists that eggs of meat from the flocks have been sold, it's not about giving anymore. If they have been sold within 14 days, we're just going to classify that as non-poultry, all right? So if you get this has been shared to some of our AVSCs. Stefan can share this with you. It's very important that the states follow this policy, this chart in classifying what is non-poultry and what is poultry, because that can impact trade in your state significantly. All right. We went through a process in this outbreak where we were having menagerie premises, where we're going in there trying to figure out what is our mandate as USDA and as a country in terms of depopulating birds on the premises. So we had to come up with a list of what is domesticated poultry that we have a mandate for. And looking at the WOA guidance, that's what we should be depopulating. So we're not going to be going to somebody's premises. If you have a peacock, you know, and that peacock is an ornamental bird, that's a show bird. We're not supposed to be depopulating those type of birds and paying indemnity for. So this is the list. So for example, just to give a good example for pigeons, if you're raising pigeons as for meat, that becomes poultry. But if you just have pigeons and you're not, I mean, sorry, I kind of the way I put it. If you have pigeons and you're raising them, that is not poultry. But if you have pigeons and you're growing them from swap, that becomes poultry. Emu, same thing. You have emus and the ornamental birds on your property, that's just a pet bird or show bird. But if you're raising that emu and you're producing milk, I mean, not milk, meat, again, that becomes poultry, just for your information. Another thing that we went through looking at the entire outbreak is we have this option now that we can put a premises under quarantine for 120 days. Remember, the states implement that quarantine for non-poultry backyard flocks. Again, I'm going to emphasize, the policy and the strategy for United States when it comes to HPAI is stamping out. And that stamping out strategy is implemented in affected poultry premises. On the non-poultry premises, there's no international guidelines. There's no WOA guidelines on how you manage your non-poultry premises. So we're putting it there out there as an option for states. If a state has a non-poultry premises and they feel like it's in the middle of nowhere, there's tremendous resources to get over there. The owner doesn't want you to get on their premises. They're going to put a gun on your head. Those type of things. You don't want to depopulate that non-poultry premises. That's fine. We have specific guidelines on how you manage that premises, and we're not going to depopulate it. You're just going to put that premises on a 120-day quarantine. Remember, that's an option. If you feel like you need to depopulate that non-poultry premises because it might affect you in your trade status, like the one big country that's still put restrictions on that, guess what? APHIS will work with you to depopulate that premises. This is extremely important for everybody to know. Okay, we're not running to depopulate non-poultry premises anymore. When we look at the molecular epidemiological data in the United States, the backyard premises, including the non-poultry premises, have not been moving disease to the commercial industry. So they've not impacted the spread of the virus. So that's part of why we took that. So there's just more information there for you to see. I mean, the guidelines for that premises owner to manage that premises, making sure that some of the birds that are still alive, they're providing water, the animal welfare issues, how to deal with the litter, how to deal with the birds that are dying, and just making sure that they themselves are protecting themselves from taking virus from that premise somewhere else. Okay, so that's part of what it is. Another policy that we changed is on this non-poultry premises. If you remember, when we started this outbreak, we were putting surveillance zones around this non-poultry premises. We also were trying to implement the WOA guidelines, and we came to realize that we don't need to do that. Okay, so there's no more surveillance zones that we put on non-poultry premises. Basically, that reduces the burdens to our responders. We're going to put outreach and information out there, and we're going to do passive surveillance. And if the birds are sick, we can go to test them to figure out what it is. I just want folks that in the United States, we can do that because we have a routine ongoing surveillance program in the United States, both active and passive. So we are looking for AI every time than other countries do. Okay. The other thing that I'd like to share is there's no requirement for a flock plan on non-poultry premises. Again, that really takes a lot of responsibility from the owner itself, emotional toll on the flock owner itself, all the responders that are supposed to respond to some 30 chickens somewhere in the middle of Washington State or Oregon that is 300 miles away. Okay, so we're trying to take all that away for us to focus on the commercial side of things that basically impact us a lot and basically also impact us in trade. Again, we started this outbreak with a 150-day quarantine, and 150-day follow. Part of that was just that we were looking at the disease moving into, wanted it that if it moves in towards the summer period, the heat will help us take care of the virus. But if you look at a FAP prep document on the website, 120 days is the follow period that we've been implementing in the United States. So we're just going back to that. Okay, for backyard premises that you know very well that you cannot go in there and clean and disinfect. So I put a picture there so for you guys to see the kind of premises that we're talking about. How do you go to clean and disinfect the premises like that? All right. Another thing that we're implementing as a policy in this outbreak is the new incubation period. It's a flock incubation period for AI. It used to be 21 days. So we're using 14 days now. That's a tremendous shift, correct? So that's one big success in what we recommended, and basically the WOA folks looked into it and implemented it in the new guidelines. Reporting Just what I want to focus here is we're going to continue to have low-part AI, like Dr. Cardona just said, but the reporting of that now has changed. So nobody should say that, oh, we don't report low-part AI anymore. So what they should say is we only will report AI, low-part AI when it is proven to have a national transmission to humans and then associated with severe consequences. If you look at for the past 20 years that we've been implementing the low-part program, we've never had an AI like that. So I see where somebody might say that, oh, we don't report AI anymore. I mean, low-part AI anymore. But the reality is, yes, we would if we have something like an H9 that starts killing people, killing birds. You know, that one we report immediately and then also report as an emerging disease, correct? So I just want folks to remember that. So don't say that we don't report low-part anymore. We report the ones that have a proven natural transmission to human beings, so they're kind of zoonotic. In terms of the population for states that get their first case, so we have 3 states: West Virginia, Hawaii, and Louisiana have not had a case. For those states, the day that they first have their first case, they will have to have a confirmation then to be able for indemnity and compensation to be authorized. So for a state like Minnesota that was still in the same outbreak, you can act on your NOR, correct? So you already know that. So just that's a big difference. In terms of the population, ventilation shutdown is something that we implemented a lot in this outbreak for the first time. And in my own opinion, this is Fidel talking, I think this has been tremendous in our success in preventing lateral spread. So you just want to make sure that, you know, the 6 criteria that has to be met, you know, the state official has to approve of it. The incident management team concurs on all the conditions have been met. The national incident coordinator concurs on all conditions have been met, correct? For this is on really, really constrained circumstances. You already have practiced this during this outbreak. Just want to remind folks on that. The depopulation and disposal flat rate, this is just a pilot study for we're trying to empower the grower. We're trying to make sure that all the funding stays locally. So this is something that our CR folks look into it. They went into the database to look at, you know, all the time that is spent on doing the population and just all the paperwork. I mean, just tremendous information that you have to put, signatures, wet signature, you name it, just everything like that. Growers are used to depopulating and disposing of their birds, correct? So if they can take the flat rate, so it's still a project, you know, we're not forcing it to anyone. We don't want to get involved, correct? So that producer receive a flat rate per bird for all the population and disposal costs. This includes feed that is destroyed. No federal or state emergency corporate agreement costs will be available, correct? When you make that decision, you take responsibility to us. You don't come to us to be blaming us, correct? You take your responsibility. If you decide to do that, you want to go get a contractor to do it for you, you're the one that is going to pay them, okay? The payment goes to you, that grower. The payment goes to you, the company, if you're the one doing it. Okay, so we don't want to get involved in this. We're just trying to simplify it so that we keep money locally. We in that downtime that the grower doesn't have funding for, this is something that they can get into and they can keep them and keep some of their employees being paid, correct? This is some of the rates. So remember, these rates are the ones that have been published now. They might change down the road when we get more data, all right? So for example, for your commercial meat turkeys is $4.20 per bird, correct? So take a look at it. If you want to participate, if you have a confirmed case, then you can work with your AVIC and get into that. On the changes in the virus elimination flat rates, this became again effective in May. So you can see the numbers there in green. So basically for floor-raised poultry, is 0.76 cents per square foot, correct? So again, you can go to our website and take a look at that. All these other ones, the 1H, you know, this is again for commercial premises or for WOA poultry premises or non-poultry premises. This form is only an estimate for payment. Actual payment is based on verified inventory and records. Okay, so that statement has been put on that form. Again, this is to streamline the process. All right, we do not need a flock plan for non-poultry premises. That's another thing that we're implementing. Indemnity for eggs, okay? So in Minnesota, again, if you have a table egg facility there, which you don't have a lot of them compared to turkeys, all we're saying that we will indemnify the inventory of the egg at the time of the presumptive positive. We're not going to be indemnifying, you know, we know very well birds will continue to lay eggs if they're depopulated, but we're indemnifying at the time of the presumptive positive. Okay, another one, permitting poultry into the infected zone. There's a rule-making process that is going on, and we're trying to get with the industry to participate, to kind of provide their input. We have discouraged the movement of live birds into the infected zone and choose not to subsidize this risk, which means if you move birds into the infected zone, when we create a control area and those birds become infected, we are not paying indemnity, correct? If you move birds into the buffer zone, you need an audit to allow you and to permit you to do that. If you do that and you pass the audit and you become infected, we'll pay for indemnity. But if you do it on your own, again, indemnity might not be paid. Another streamline that we've done in terms of environmental testing, post-virus elimination, we used to take 10 samples, pool samples, basically. We've cut down by 50%. We all need just 5. So the labs can look at the directive from MVSR. So that's cutting our costs by 50%. And part of that is we went through our database and realized that we've really never had, premises that was clean and disinfected, and the virus was still in that environment to infect the birds and all that. So why are we taking 10 pool samples? We're going into 5. So that was a good decision. The other one is recovery of free status. Remember, way back, it was 90 days after the disinfection complete date for their last affected premises. That has been reduced to 28 days. That's a huge success to the United States. Okay, think about it. So we now can declare free, and this freedom is on poultry, not non-poultry. So the freedom declaration for a state and the freedom declaration for a country is based on your poultry, not non-poultry. So we're implementing that one. What are the other things that I need to kind of talk here? In financing, again, just remember, anything that deals with money, somebody has to sign it. It's not you talk on the phone on someone. No, somebody needs to approve that, and it has to be in writing. Anything that involves money, just make sure that you contact the appropriate folks. Make sure that if it's contracting, they have to approve it before any activity is being done. Okay, so just remember that federal contracting should be used as a last resort. We've saved a lot of money during this outbreak because we didn't use contractors a lot. We empowered the growers and the state to be doing some of that work, and it's been very successful for everyone. These rules also apply in reimbursement. All rental equipment and labor rates must be approved in advance. All single expenses, $5,000 and above, must be approved in advance. So just remember, everything got to be approved in advance when it comes to money, correct? Carbon material costs must be approved in advance. Corporate agreement, the emergency corporate agreement, they have a new form that is available. You can check the website to see how they've streamlined that process also. And my colleague, Dr. Patricia Fox, is the one that is really responsible in signing and approving this cooperative agreement for the response. In terms of incidents, state response and containment plan, your own Dr. Mary Donahue has joined our poultry health staff as a full-time staff for us. So this is going to be her own baby to kind of work on it. So she will be working with all the states to make sure that they have an approved initial state response and containment plan. So that's the one that you work with in your state. You already have her there and you know her very well. So these are some of the other policies. You can go on our website and look at some of the changes on the landfill disposal guidelines, indemnity evaluation, all that's on the website. And I just showed you where you can go. You click fat prep, you Google, you click on high pathogenicity avian influenza, you pick on our response and policy information, and you can go and see all the new policies. It's on our website, correct? Every information has been posted. If you don't see something, do not hesitate to call me or any of my colleagues on our poultry health team. On vaccination, I just kind of wanted to just say certain things so folks can understand why this has been difficult for us as a country, correct? And I'm not going to focus on it too much, but this is what I just want to share, folks, because sometimes information is powerful. I just want folks to realize that every time we talk about vaccination in the United States, we've talked about it every time. Since we started this AI program in the United States, vaccine has always been a talk. We've maintained banks and never used them, and the pharmaceutical companies would destroy the frozen antigen, and all that money goes for waste, correct? But this is what I want people to realize. The success of the United States, especially our poultry industry, has been a collective success, which means the turkey industry, the table leg industry, the broiler industry, the primary breeders, how they debate among each other, correct? They always come to a consensus to look at it as a whole. All right, one person might be suffering, but you look at the totality of the country and what is the success for the country. That's what has made the poultry commodity in the United States very successful. You know, under that umbrella that we have an NPIP that most countries do not have. That's what has made us the #1 poultry trading country in the world, except Brazil that beats us hand down when it comes to trade of poultry meat. All right. So when it comes to genetics, you know, so folks should understand this. We, United States, account for 60% of the primary breeding genetics in the world. So when we're talking about vaccines, you got to realize what happens. Say, oh, United States vaccinates and countries are telling you that they're not going to work with. That's food security for the entire world or for people that depend on that genetic stock, correct? I just give you a good example. I just had a meeting in Miami probably a month ago with 15 CBOs in the Caribbean islands. And I looked at them in the face and said, if United States vaccinate, what are you going to do? We're going to ban United States, correct? That's food security for them. During COVID, they all learned that they depended on us a lot. Okay, 95% of everything they get comes from the United States. And guess what? We blocked everything that goes to them. And they looked at it like, oh my God, our folks had a huge food security problem. I just want to share some of these things with folks to understand that the decision to vaccinate is not an easy one. 90% of the broader genetics comes globally from the United States. 40% of table leg genetics come from the United States. Okay, so folks need to know that. Another thing that I really need to tell people to do is, people talk, oh, the French are vaccinating. Oh yeah, they're supposed to vaccinate. Their poultry industry is minutiae compared to us. What they're vaccinating is their turkeys that they produce foie gras. Okay, foie gras is a delicacy that the French produce. In the United States, we have only 3 companies, 2 in New York, that can do foie gras because the animal rights folks have driven them. They've driven that industry out of the United States, correct? They lost 85% of their foie gras. There's no industry in us in the United States that we've lost even close to 16%, correct? So they have a reason why they want to vaccinate. If that happens to us, let me say, oh, our primary breeders, that we have 60%, we provide 60% of the genetic stock all over the world, and we lose even 20%, guess what? United States might look at vaccine, okay? Because then we're protecting our genetic stock. We are not there. I put this information here on our inventory to get people to understand how big our industry is. Okay, we look at this outbreak, oh, this is the largest outbreak in the history of the United States. Yeah, it is. But when you look at our inventory, it's nothing. Okay, when you look at the inventory in terms of turkeys, I mean, if I want to be conservative, say 6% have been affected, 94% have not been affected. You look at our table legs, let me say 16% has been affected, 84% has not been affected. You look at broilers that are like McDonald's compared to all other commercial industry in the United States in terms of size, 0.04% have been affected, which means 99.1% has not been affected. So why do you talk about vaccine, correct? Let me show you another figure. The United States poultry industry made the most money, okay, ever for a long period in 2022 when we had the largest disease outbreak in the United States. They made $77 billion. They made $46 billion in 2021. So why would you talk about vaccine, correct? It's good to talk about it for us to prepare about it, but the implementation on that is not as easy as people can think about, correct? I don't see, I mean, talking to so many, we have 181 member trading countries, 182 including us. 80 of them we do bilateral agreements when it comes to trade. I don't see any one of them that has told us that if we vaccinate, they're going to trade with us. Immediately they heard that the French were vaccinating. A lot of them contact us already and said, if you take products from France, we're blocking your trade. And sometimes when we talk about trade, people think only on the international trade, correct? Selling the chicken pox for $1 billion to China. That's a huge profit margin, correct? You look at that, if you were renting down the United States, you're looking at 200 million, you lose 800 million, correct? So the broader industry is making money from that, correct? There's nothing wrong with that. This 77 billion I'm talking about, let's say 7 billion is international trade. 70 billion is domestic trade. Do you think we've had discussion on, oh, if Minnesota vaccinate tomorrow, what would Indiana do to Minnesota, correct? What would Iowa do with Minnesota? We've not even had those domestic discussions, what other states would do in one state to vaccinate, correct? So I'm just putting information there just for information for folks to realize that the decision to vaccinate is not as easy as you think, correct? It's very complicated. So in that instance, we have not looked at approving vaccine as CVO. We've looked at several countries that have implemented vaccination. They're endemic today. So they're vaccinating to live with the disease. We will probably vaccinate to kill. Okay, so it's not an easy situation. There are a lot of obstacles. There's no lower guidelines on vaccination that makes every country to be confident with each other, correct? There's lack of international standards in terms of surveillance, depending on the vaccine you're using, depending on the test. We don't even have a comprehensive test, you know, depending on the vaccine that we're going to use, correct? So it's still a long thing, a long discussion and complicated discussion for folks to realize that it's not as easy as you see for a country like us that dominates in terms of poultry domestically and poultry consumption and production internationally. So the last thing I just want to share is there was an import alert that went out. You know, probably some of you have seen this. Immediately, the French started vaccinating. That import alert went out to just let folks to know that we are not trading with France, correct? So what I want folks to understand is it's easy for people sometimes to sit and say, oh, look at what this country is doing to us. Do you know what we do to them? So people forget to realize that in our regulation, we have it in our regulation now currently that we don't trade with anybody who would vaccinate, if you didn't know that, correct? So all that has to be fixed. So moving forward, we're going to see what the French are doing. We're going to go there to evaluate them. They've not provided us any information that for any sensible country, you look at what they've developed for their vaccine program, you can look at it and evaluate and say, oh, wow, we can take this, justify it, allow for things to move. Nope, we don't have that yet. Okay, so people are going to go there to evaluate that. So it would take time for this alert that went out to ban everything that is coming from France. You know, with transiting France, I just want you to know that some specific industries have been affected tremendously in the United States, especially the ones that deal with Hubbard. You know, they get specific genetics from France for long-growing birds, chickens, and all that stuff. They've been impacted. But again, in the totality as a country and in protecting our industry, USDA have to do what they have to do based on some of the inputs that we've gotten for some of our trading partners and us protecting our poultry industry. With that, I just want to thank you to have given me this opportunity to share this information with you so that you realize that the question on vaccine is not as easy as everyone thinks. Thanks again for that opportunity.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody who stuck with us for all of the information that you received today. As we noted at the beginning of this webinar, this is recorded and it will be included on our members only portion of the website. We're already beginning work for next month's webinar, which will be held the week before Thanksgiving. So stay tuned for the lineup of exciting speakers that we're working on for that webinar. So with that, thank you all for joining us and we will see you soon.